The Black Archive.
There was a time when war had boundaries, a place where it happened, a direction it moved, a line that separated those who fought from those who waited. You could point to a map and say, "It is happening there," and believe, at least for a moment, that distance meant safety. But that idea did not survive the 20th century. What you are about to hear is based on documented historical accounts from the years leading into the Segunda Guerra Mundial, a conflict that would not only redraw borders, but erase the very concept of distance as protection. Because this was no longer a war defined by armies alone, it was a war that expanded beyond battlefields, beyond soldiers, beyond anything the world had previously understood. It became something else entirely. After the Primeira Guerra Mundial ended, there was a silence that felt heavier than the fighting itself. Entire regions had been reduced to scars, landscapes reshaped by artillery and loss, and millions of lives had simply disappeared into the mud and smoke of trenches. For those who survived, the belief that such destruction could never be repeated was not naive. It was necessary. People needed to believe that what they had witnessed was the worst humanity could produce. They called it the war to end all wars, not because they were certain it would be, but because they could not imagine enduring anything beyond it. And yet, beneath that fragile hope, something was already shifting. Not loudly, not violently, but steadily. War was changing, evolving into something less contained, less predictable, and far more dangerous. In the years that followed, conflicts began to emerge in places that felt distant to much of the world. They were seen as isolated events, regional tensions that did not yet seem connected. But each one revealed a pattern that few fully recognized at the time. In Asia, expansionist movements demonstrated how quickly territory could be taken, when resistance was limited and consequences were uncertain. In Africa, invasion showed that the rules once thought to govern warfare were beginning to collapse. What made these conflicts different was not just their existence, but how they were fought. Civilians were no longer simply caught in the crossfire. They were becoming part of the strategy itself. Villages were bombed not because they held military value, but because they held people. Entire populations were subjected to violence designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to break the will of those who might resist. The world saw it happening, and for a time it reacted with concern. But concern turned into hesitation, and hesitation eventually became something far more dangerous: acceptance. The idea of a war without limits was not entirely new. Military thinkers had long imagined conflicts in which victory required total commitment, where the destruction of an enemy state might extend beyond armies and into the fabric of society itself. But for a long time, such ideas remained theoretical, constrained by the practical limitations of earlier eras. That changed with industrialization. As nations grew more powerful, as their economies expanded and their ability to produce increased beyond anything seen before, the scale of war transformed with them. It was no longer just about soldiers facing each other across a battlefield. It became about factories producing weapons without pause, about railways moving resources continuously, about entire populations contributing to the effort whether they wore a uniform or not. War was no longer an event. It became a condition, and once society itself became part of the war, there was no clear line separating those involved from those who were not. Governments began to mobilize everything they had, not just armies, but industries, labor forces, and daily life itself. Work was no longer simply about survival or progress. It became part of a larger machine, one that fed directly into conflict. The people building equipment, the people transporting supplies, the people maintaining infrastructure, all of them became essential components of the war effort. And if they were essential, they could also be targeted. The logic was simple and devastating. If destroying a factory weakened the enemy, then the factory was a valid target. If destroying a city disrupted production, then the city itself became part of the battlefield. The distinction between military and civilian began to dissolve, not because it was misunderstood, but because it was no longer considered necessary. The sky, once a place of distance and detachment, became one of the most dangerous fronts of all. Before, danger came from what you could see approaching, from movements on the ground, from enemies whose presence could be anticipated, even if only for a moment. But aerial warfare changed that completely. Bombers did not need to engage directly. They did not need to face resistance in the traditional sense. They only needed to arrive, release their payload, and leave. And when they did, the destruction was not selective. It did not distinguish between soldier and civilian, between strategic target and living space. Entire neighborhoods could be erased in minutes, not because of who was there, but because of what was there: industry, infrastructure, morale. And when that happens enough times, fear becomes constant, not tied to a specific place or moment, but to the simple fact that it could happen again at any time. Without warning, one of the clearest glimpses of what this new form of war would become appeared before the global conflict fully erupted during the Guerra Civil Española. What began as an internal struggle quickly drew in external forces, turning the country into a testing ground for tactics that would later define a much larger war. Cities were bombed not as collateral damage, but as deliberate demonstrations of power. The objective was not just to defeat opposing forces, but to instill fear so deeply that resistance itself would collapse. It was a shift that could not be undone. When civilians became targets by design, the rules that had once governed warfare no longer applied in any meaningful way. Violence expanded not because it was uncontrolled, but because it was being used with increasing precision toward broader goals. As these patterns repeated, something else began to happen. The shock that once accompanied such events started to fade, not because the violence decreased, but because it became familiar. People learned to expect it, to anticipate it, to live with it. What would have once been seen as unthinkable gradually became part of reality. Bombings, executions, displacement, these were no longer isolated tragedies. They were part of a system. And the more they occurred, the easier they became to justify. In a war where survival was framed as absolute, where victory was tied to existence itself, any action that contributed to that outcome could be seen as necessary. That is one of the most dangerous aspects of total war, not just the destruction it causes, but the way it reshapes the boundaries of what is considered acceptable. By the time the world was fully drawn into global conflict, the transformation was already complete. The Segunda Guerra Mundial did not introduce total war. It revealed it. Everything that had been building in the years before was unleashed at once, on a scale that had never been experienced. There was no longer any illusion of separation between front lines and home fronts. Every place had the potential to become a target. Every person had the potential to become part of the conflict, whether they chose to or not. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Borders no longer provided protection. The war reached everywhere, and at the center of all of this were ordinary people. Not those making decisions at the highest levels, not those directing movements on maps, but those living their lives within systems they could not control. People who worked, who built, who raised families, who believed, at least for a time, that they were separate from the violence unfolding elsewhere. Until they weren't. Some contributed to the war effort directly, others became victims of it, and many experienced both without ever having a choice in the matter. That is what total war does. It removes the ability to remain outside of it. It pulls everything inward until participation is no longer voluntary. By the end, the world had changed in ways that could not be reversed. War was no longer defined by where it happened, but by how deeply it could penetrate into every aspect of life. It was no longer something that occurred at a distance, something that could be observed or avoided. It became something that could enter homes, reshape cities, alter economies, and redefine entire societies. Something that could be heard in the distance and felt without warning. Something that could arrive without being seen and leave nothing unchanged. Total war did not just expand the scale of conflict. It redefined its nature. It proved that once the boundaries are removed, once everything becomes part of the struggle, there is no clear way to contain it again. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is not how it begins, but how quickly the world learns to adapt to it, to accept it, to continue moving forward, even as the definition of war changes around it. Because once everything becomes part of war, there is nothing left that exists outside of it.